Hi, this is Jay Rogers. I am the director of the Forerunner, and this is the second video I've done on what's really happening in Russia and Ukraine. This is called Media Lies on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and this is an article I just posted. One of the things I've found interesting is that even though a lot of people are believing the lies by our media offered on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, many people actually do see through them, and I want to go through and categorize the lies that we're being told over and over again. So the conservatives know that the media lied to them about the Russia collusion hoax. This was back when, some Russians actually did buy about $100,000 worth of Facebook ads, and supposedly that swayed the election to Trump back in 2016. Always found that a little bit ridiculous, especially when the United States has spent millions and millions of dollars to influence other elections overseas, including the election of Volodymir Zelenskyy and his two predecessors. So then Trump was impeached over a phone call, basically talking about the corruption and relating that to Biden. And it's just, really to me, it's the height of hypocrisy that our media is talking about this now. And a lot of this stuff is coming to light that, in fact, the Bidens were involved in Ukraine and China and these other countries and were very corrupt. So it's kind of mystery to me that as they lied about that, so many people just are believing the Pentagon and the State Department, which are all, these are executive branch departments. And we're just hearing in the media the same talking points droned into us 24/7. And even if we know it's propaganda, studies have shown that we still end up believing a lot of it because that's all we hear. In my last video, I gave you these different podcasts. I've added a couple more of articles here. These articles are by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, and these are all published in the Forerunner over the years. It's really amazing how accurate Solzhenitsyn was in describing what's now happening to the West, finally happening to the West, and really warning about the situation in Ukraine long before it took place, and describing what happened to the Soviet Union. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was one of Putin's foremost advisors after the Soviet Union fell. And so if you read Putin's speeches on Ukraine, you hear an echo of this one here. A word to Ukrainians and Belarusians. These are like, this speech here that everyone thinks is so chilling is actually very factual, and it's based on Solzhenitsyn's earlier essay in his book, Rebuilding Russia. So you can read those. I talked about this before. I also am going to refer to these war maps, and especially this site, Southfront. This is a Ukrainian site, and this is a Russian site. We don't get any Russian propaganda. We only get Ukrainian propaganda. So I'm not saying that, Russia doesn't spew out propaganda, but our State Department is basically just repeating what Ukraine says. And on both sides, this is true. When war is declared, truth is the first casualty. Both sides say we don't want war, and yet they instigate it. The opposite party is always alone guilty. The enemy is always demonized, right? Our cause is noble. Our opponents is not. The enemy systematically commits cruelties. Our mishaps are involuntary. The enemy uses forbidden weapons. We suffer small losses. Those of the enemy are enormous. Artists and intellectuals back our causes, Hollywood and so on. Our cause is sacred. All those who doubt our propaganda are traitors. So that's true in Russia. It's true in Ukraine. It's true in the United States. And so as Christians, we need to be aware of this. And we need to understand God has a greater purpose in all of this, but at the same time, we need to understand you are being lied to. We are being lied to. That's going to be my point here. And so it's not to be interpreted as being pro-Russian or pro-Putin. I think we do need to look at Russian propaganda to see the other side of the story and understand the truth lies somewhere in the middle. I love Russia and Ukraine. I've spent lots of my time there. It amounts to months out of my life. And when I went there on mission trips to establish the Russian Forerunner and several video projects we did with churches there, I didn't stay the entire time in hotels and eat out. I spent a lot of times with families, traveling with my friends in trains, cross country for several days in some cases. And I have friends from Ukraine who have very strong feelings against Russia, and some friends from Russia who has very strong feelings against Ukraine. So I'm kind of heartbroken by that. And I see the constant barrage of war footage, and I want to sympathize with Ukraine, but at the same time, I understand that we're being conditioned to hate Russia and think that Russians that support their president are either evil or they're being duped, and neither one of those is true. Okay, so the first casualty of war is always truth. Don't forget that. Lie number one told to us by the media is Russia is losing the war to capture Kiev. Russia is losing the war, and the strategy to capture Kiev is largely stalled. How do we know that that's not true? I'm going to show you a little video here while we go through this. And this is recent footage from the war in Donbass, so you can see what's actually going on. We don't actually get any war footage because our reporters are not allowed in there by the Ukrainian government. They don't want you to see what's happening, but this is all footage that's taken by Russia. It's obviously propaganda, but it shows you some things that are actually happening on the ground in Donbass. Okay, Russia's losing the war. This is based on two false assumptions. First, Russia is trying to occupy Ukraine and absorb it. And then second, that Russian generals have tried to take Kiev, but have faced fierce resistance because they did not expect the Ukrainians to be so resilient, and now they're faltering. The reason why this is wrong is simply because we know Russia has been winning since the first day. On February 24th, the Ukrainian air defense and systems and communications were knocked out within a matter of hours. The entire Navy was destroyed. 85% of their air force is not flying. So the military operation has been focused on two tactics. First, containing the Ukrainian army that's holed up in several major cities, including the capital of Kiev. And while those armies are being occupied, the second main priority has not been to capture Kiev, but to destroy the Ukrainian army and militia groups in southeast Ukraine. That's what we're looking at here. That's included the heavy shelling of Mariupol, which has basically fallen. It's all but fallen. And then it's a foregone conclusion the Black Sea and Azov Sea are already controlled by Russia. They have been for many weeks, and that was a key strategy for victory. So Mariupol has been a bloody mess, and we knew that that was going to happen from the very beginning because that's where the Azov battalion is holed up, and they were the Nazis that Putin referred to, that they want to denazify Ukraine. It's not Zelenskyy. That's what our press will tell you. Putin is not trying to kill Zelenskyy and occupy Ukraine. That might be something that happens further down the road, but the primary targets were always the southeast and then also the Donbass region in the east. Okay, so in time, this is just a matter of time. Very soon the supplies to the Ukrainian army are going to be cut off, and then either the Ukrainian army will be destroyed or they'll surrender. And so I don't see after that Russia trying to capture Kiev. It might be unnecessary because Kiev won't have an army to defend the eastern part of the country. And you can't fight a war without an army. And so if that's the case, it should end very soon. I think that's one of the reasons why Zelenskyy at this point is trying to really prosecute the case for peace. Okay. So this is what's going on now. You can watch this whole video. I'll provide a link to it, specifically this video. But you can see they're creating this cauldron, and Russian forces are going to basically do this. They're going to close this area here and then close this area so people can't escape. And once that area is closed, these armies will not have supplies. They won't be able to refuel. And then the reason for the armies in the north around Kharkiv and Kiev is to contain those armies and keep them occupied, so those 100,000 can't join these 60,000. Okay, so that's what's going on there. All right, line number 2 is that fierce Ukrainian resistance is responsible for 10,000 soldiers killed per day. All right, so both sides have put out propaganda on this. I wanted to show you the number of casualties here. This is the most recent breakdowns. Okay, so as far as civilians go, the Ukrainian government claims that 70,000 or excuse me, 7,000 civilians have been killed, around that number. The United Nations estimates in the same time period that only 1,400 have been killed. That number is low. This number is high. The truth is somewhere in the middle. Okay, there will be, when this is all over, several thousand civilians killed. So that's important to understand. Okay. Ukraine claims that 1,300 of their own forces have been killed. The U.S. estimate says that it's triple that. All right, double or triple that. Russia, interestingly enough, claims that the same number of its own forces were killed as Ukraine. So Ukraine says 1,300 of our forces were killed. Russia claims that 1,300 of our forces were killed. Very interesting. But then Ukraine and NATO have said now that I think NATO says 15,000 Russian forces were killed, and Ukraine is now saying that it's between 18,000 and 20,000. Okay, that number is not true. Okay, this number is not true either, but likely the number is between 13,000 and 7,000. So for the sake of argument, I'm going to say 3 to 4,000 on the Ukrainian side and 3 to 4,000 on the Russian side. I don't know. No one knows. But when you hear those huge numbers, you're being lied to. All right? And the same thing goes on in the east. There's an estimate by the Donetsk forces who are fighting the Russians. All right? So that's fairly straightforward. Don't be fooled by media estimates on the number of Russians killed. This is the one that really I find humorous. That Putin fears a revolution in Moscow. It will be impossible for him to stay in power, and that it's just a matter of time that the Russian support. This is line number 4 as well. Russian support of the war will drop once Russians sees with their own eyes the atrocities and war crimes being committed by the Russian army. All right, I want to look at this a little bit. This is the Putin approval rating since he took office. All right, he came to office after the Chechnya war, because he was prime minister then, with 84% approval rating. And his approval rating has fluctuated between 84 to the 60s, which is higher than any president in our recent history. This is independent polling. It's not all Russian propaganda. His highest approval rating was 89%, which I don't believe that one. But the current one, since the war started, is 83%. At the very beginning of the war, back in, when they were building up around November, his approval rating had fallen to 63. Now it's up to 83. And this has been confirmed by a number of media outlets. They're not denying that his approval rating has soared. So the whole idea that there's going to be a revolution in Moscow, not going to happen. Okay, this is another media lie, something that our president has been pushing very strongly. Also, the oligarchs in Russia are controlled by Putin. He chooses the oligarchs who support him. And he's been very tough on getting rid of oligarchs who are corrupt that don't support him. So, yes, corrupt government, but not run by oligarchs. The government is run by Putin. And he does have support. The other thing is that we already talked about the civilian casualties. And this is what I would say about this. During our NATO Middle East wars from 2002 until present, right? In the very beginning of those wars, there were a huge number of civilian casualties. From August 2002 to March 2003, there were tens of thousands of civilians killed in Iraq. And the number of Americans who favored the war fluctuated between 52% to 59%. And then those who opposed the war fluctuated between 35 to 43%. So for the sake of argument, if we agree that the Russian approval of Putin will drop dramatically, then we must assume the Russians are far more civilized and compassionate than Americans are towards our own military leadership and president. Okay, is Putin a war criminal? You'll hear this over and over again. Putin is a thug, he's evil, he's a war criminal, and so on. Civilians get killed in warfare that involves shelling and bombing, even while they're not primary targets. NATO's wars in the Middle East prove that to the tune of 200,000 civilians killed. And I wanted to show you this little timeline of wars. First of all, these are the civilian deaths in Iraq from 2003 to present. I added these up and it was close to 200,000. It was like 180, 190. I didn't do the smaller numbers, but I added the thousands. And these are documented civilian deaths. The number is probably much higher than that. But this is an abomination. I mean, I supported this war when it started, and I've come to believe I was woefully wrong about that, because these numbers do not justify the threat that Iraq posed to the United States. These are civilians now. These aren't soldiers. Okay, if you want to look at the total number of people killed, I'll show you another graph. It's interesting. I'll scroll down to the bottom here. This is from 1989 to 2017. There have been 10 wars in the Middle East, 6 million killed. This is the U.S. war record. These are the number of sanctions that we got over that. Okay. Supported by NATO, supported by the UN. So it's a matter of perspective, which side you come down on. What's really happening in Kiev, Ukraine is an article you can look at. We did that at the very beginning. And we've been saying since the beginning that the Azov battalion in Mariupol and other places are using civilians as human shields in hospitals and schools. That is a war crime. All right. And this is from the UN report. This is now the UN. This is not NATO. It's not Russia. It's not Ukraine. But this is like an independent statement. The Russian Federation's representative, well, this is from Russia, but this is something that the UN has recognized. I'm sorry, I said that a little bit wrongly, but the Russian Federation's representative called on the Security Council to keep in mind the humanitarian context of what's happening in Ukraine and not rely on Ukrainian politicians and mendacious social networks for their political views. Citing an ongoing information war in the West, he said Ukrainian radicals and neo-Nazis, and not the Russian armed forces, are holding hostages in towers and cities and using civilians as human shields. I believe it's happening. I don't think it's the majority of civilians that are being killed, but it's a good number of them are due to that. The Ukrainian government has also handed out over 10,000, they say 15,000 or so AK-47s and other, instructed them to make bombs and so on. So they've turned civilians into combatants. So I think that many of the casualties are due to that. The Russian Federation units had also declared a ceasefire that radicals in Mariupol that violated, as heard an intercepted radio conversation instructing them to shoot at the legs of those who are headed toward humanitarian corridors. Further, the deployment of heavy weaponry, including bombardment artillery, had become a rule for Ukrainian nationalist battalions, while radicals were continuing to hold over 1,500 foreigners hostage in multiple cities. So what they'll do is they'll put cannons like howitzers, munitions inside buildings, and there's a little center block. Most of their apartment buildings or their flats are in quad shapes, and in the middle there'll be a courtyard, and they'll put a gun there. When you fire a gun like that, it blows out all the windows. So some of the damage that you're seeing in these videos and pictures are actually damaged by Ukrainian artillery, and then once they fire, the Russians fire back, and that's why civilian buildings are being hit. So there's no evidence that Russia is indiscriminately targeting the civilian population. If that is happening, we should absolutely condemn it, right? But I just told you that most of the war crimes are actually on the Ukrainian side. All right, now you might say, that's just Russian propaganda, isn't it? Right? But if someone's aiming at a military target that's hidden inside a civilian structure, such as a church, a hospital, a school, or mall, a city square, in war, that's fair game. It's horrifying that civilians are being killed, but it's not intentionally targeting civilians. And I also find it, this is the thing that I look at, why would Russia be indiscriminately targeting civilians? Is it just to humiliate the Ukrainians? Which is the narrative we're being given. But all that does is it just creates sympathy for Ukraine and make the whole world hate Russia, right? So then we might ask, why might the Ukrainian military be targeting, why might the Ukrainian military and government make civilian areas targets? The answer is the same. It creates sympathy for Ukraine and makes the whole world kill Russia. These are people that want to hang on to power, okay? So we'll find out. It'll be easy to prove after the war. I might be wrong, but there are already reports coming out of Mariupol that civilians are being used as human shields. Okay, so in Donbass, there are a great number of Ukrainian civilians and deaths. And in other words, people living in Donbass, Russians and Ukrainians, are Ukrainian civilians, right? And so a lot of this is the Ukrainian military firing on pro-Russian Ukrainians. That's been going on for 8 years. Is that a Ukrainian war crime or a Russian war crime? That there are civilian deaths going on in a civil war within Ukraine? Or is the whole thing just due to Russia? All right. I don't know. I think it's very complicated. I think both sides are guilty, but it's good to listen to both sides, and we only hear one side. Okay. This is another lie, and it's based on the narrative that Russia's trying to occupy Ukraine and topple the government rather than it's just trying to liberate Donbass. So Putin has said, that he said, and I went over this in the last video, he said that our plan is not to occupy Ukraine. He said that literally. And he said that our plan is to demilitarize the country of Ukraine, denazify the Ukrainian nationalist militias, not denazify the Jewish president. People ridicule that, but that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the nationalist militias who are Nazis, and there's numerous articles. If you just Google Ukrainian nationalist militias and Nazis, you'll see numerous articles in the West for the past 7 years warning us about this, the fact that Ukraine does have a Nazi problem. And then and so both of these are things that are happening. This is inevitable. Obtain a guarantee of neutral status. Ukraine never joined NATO. That's been agreed on. And then this one is a sticking point. Recognize Crimea, Lugansk, and Donetsk as territory separate from Ukraine. Ukraine has agreed to this one already twice in the Minsk agreements. They're willing to reiterate that as long as there are security agreements. But they don't want to recognize Crimea as part of Russia. So this is a tragedy. Ukraine's NATO status was far off prior to the war, and the Donbass regions and Crimea were already lost to Ukraine, and so now the destruction of the Ukrainian army is becoming a reality. That's a tragedy because all of these demands could have been met without war and the death of 1,000 troops and civilians, or at least meet them and then see if Putin was lying all along. And then, sure, at that point, I would support NATO actually going into Ukraine. But I just don't believe that that's what... I think that what Putin said in his speech was accurate. That this was their goal right here. And that this is the ceasefire terms right there. Okay, so NATO leaders are talking tough publicly, but they know the defeat of the Ukrainian army is a foregone conclusion. It's happening as we speak. You can go back and watch that video. I'll include the link to it. And the sanctions on Russia are hurting the West as much as the East. This is the other one that drives me crazy. I keep hearing these actual sentences. This is straight out of the Russian playbook, and this war is not going according to Putin's plan. That assumes that there must be some type of secret playbook or a plan that Putin doesn't want anyone else to know about. But our Western intelligence agencies have thankfully leaked it out to our press. I just find that it's Orwellian. It's just like that. The lies that we nations tell during wars. It's ridiculous. Putin said literally, Russia has no plans to occupy Ukraine in his speech right before the war. And so he really must have meant something else, even though the battle tactics line up exactly with what Putin says. These are misinterpreted as a failed plan to occupy all of Ukraine. So who's lying here? Okay, there's no doubt both nations are lying. Russia's lying, Ukraine's lying. It's war propaganda. But we're conditioned to think Russia is lying while every report out of Ukrainian government is the truth. And far worse, Since 2004, Western leaders have worked to keep Ukraine impoverished and corrupt as a way to cultivate a puppet state. Three separate puppet presidents who all started off saying they were going to fight corruption, became incredibly corrupt, and then each one of them realized that turning towards NATO was not going to work, because all the West really wants is for Ukraine to be a wedge to destabilize Russian security. And we've had, Pelosi's family, Biden's family, Clinton Foundation becoming personally enriched by corrupt business dealings in Russia and in Ukraine. So I think that in coming months, we're going to see that's going to be evident. This whole web of lies is going to be collapsed. And we'll see that our whole strategy to use Ukraine to dismantle Russia as a power is going to backfire. And so we have an opportunity as Christians, as ministries, to try to encourage both. First of all, I think we should encourage our own president, whoever our next president is, get us out of these entangling alliances. They've done us no good for the past 40 years. They've just brought misery in the world. Everything from Vietnam till present has just brought misery, didn't accomplish anything. And there's such a great opportunity to let's encourage these nations to grow. Let's help them work toward reformation of society according to biblical principles, which is happening, by the way. Russia is in much better shape economically, spiritually, in every way since the time of the Soviet Union. So most of our Western political leaders don't have Christian love and humanitarian compassion, but they've contributed to the corruption and profited from the chaos. So there's many more lies. Those are the big ones. I understand people hate Putin, and I don't. I'm not saying Putin is a good guy. I'm not. He's ruthless. This is a ruthless autocrat, and he's also a very effective autocrat. He has benefited Russia economically, like I said. So, I think that if we had a president like that, many conservatives would love Putin. Putin ran against Biden. I think that a lot of conservatives would support him. People say, I'll give you an example of this. People say that, Putin was the head of the KGB, and Putin was actually not the head of the KGB. He was the head of the FSB, which was the agency established after the Soviet Union fell. So he was like the leader of what our CIA would be. He would be like George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush was the director of the CIA. Putin was the director of the Russian intelligence agency. During the time of the Cold War, in the 80s, Putin was a minor colonel stationed in East Germany, and he did not support communism. All right. So this is another little one. Putin is a thug. He's a former KGB agent, and true, but not exactly right. Everybody in Russian politics today was involved with the Soviet Union, just about. Okay, so there's good reasons to hate Putin. I'm not saying there aren't, but we need to be, as Christ said, wise as serpents, innocent as doves, and discerning what is the truth and what's a lie. We can know that both governments are corrupt, while hating neither Russians nor Ukrainians are evil. We shouldn't hate Russians, and we shouldn't believe Ukrainians are the innocent victims either. They're both, there's both corruption, and there are also good people there that we should love and we should pray for. So it's important to know we're being lied to, and it's even more important to ask why we're being lied to. This is the quote from Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn that I talked about in the beginning. This is a great quote. We know they're lying, they know they're lying, and they know we know they are lying. We know they know we know they are lying, and yet they're still lying. What does that mean? That's not just talking about, it's talking about the Soviet Union, of course, and I'm not equating Russia or the United States or Ukraine with the Soviet Union, but that's the nature of propaganda, right? Studies have shown, even if people know it's propaganda, they still end up believing most of it, if that's all you ever hear. Okay, so just be aware of that. Be wise as serpents, be innocent as doves. All right. So I put different reasons here. The question as to why. First of all, our government officials actually do control most of the media. I've written another article showing that, I talked mainly about Bezos, but there's a graph I can link you to that shows that 85% of the American media is being controlled by a very small group of people. And most of them are beholden to the Washington establishment in some way. And then I think that our government officials actually believe their own lies. They establish a narrative that they believe is true, and then they interpret facts that they see as contrary to their own lies. They reinterpret them as propaganda. This is a kind of double speak. This is what 1984 was about. I need to italicize that, but 1984, there was a double speak. Words take on opposite meanings of what they really mean. People that we send into war become peacemakers. And then there's also the phenomenon of accusing an opponent of the thing that you yourself are really guilty of. So we've killed thousands of civilians. So killing of thousands of civilians and hitting civilians in Ukraine is a war atrocity. It's a war crime and an atrocity. But when we go in and destroy an entire civilian infrastructure and kill hundreds of thousands of people, innocent people, civilians, that's defending freedom. Okay. One of the things that Russia has done that makes it look like that they're losing is they're being very careful not to knock out the entire civilian infrastructure, because they know that after this is over, they want to work with Ukraine. Okay. Our method is much different than that. So I think that people have trouble, right? Our government officials use a narrative from the beginning that would justify regime change in Moscow. As the war develops, the facts are not interpreted objectively or even abductively, but they're interpreted to fit a narrative. So when Russia doesn't topple Kyiv in 1 week, according to the plan, that secret plan that only Putin and our State Department knows about, this is interpreted as to mean Russia's losing the war because it's not accomplishing the objective of conquering Kyiv and toppling the Ukrainian government. Okay, so where are we going in all of this? This was a famous movie or book back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. There was a book and a movie, Quo Vadis. It was about Peter is on his way to Rome, and Peter tries to escape from Rome, is in the novel, because he knows he's going to be martyred, and he's met by Jesus, and he said, "Where are you going?" All right, where are we going in all of this? Are we going toward Christ or away from him? Okay, so Soviet communism fell in 1991, and it opened up the world to an unheralded time of peace. There's been a decline in hunger and poverty in the world, and a greater spread of Christianity like we've never seen before in all of history. I told you already that at that time, I believed that the Christian nations of the world would get together and we would fight Islam. But then I realized that, this is not the way we fight Islam. We fight Islam with the gospel. Okay? We don't indiscriminately bomb civilians and hope that they're going to accept Christ. I realized that that was wrong. Okay? So what I realized is that the real enemy is neoliberal globalism. Okay? Soviet communism has a twin cousin. It's called Western egalitarian humanism. In other words, people are equal before the state, and the state gives us our rights. But in true freedom, in true federal government, in a true federal system, like a republican system of government, we are equal before God, and the state protects our rights. So the problem with many Christian conservatives, even the very patriotic people, is that we've been globalists. I've been a globalist. I had to change my mind about that. I had to repent. We want America first, but that means America first in the whole world. Like, we rule the world. We force our way of life on others rather than being an example. So what we really want is a globalist world order led by America and NATO. The Russia-Ukraine crisis is a snapshot. There's a much larger spiritual war going on. The war is between the conservative civilization states like Russia, like Brazil, like Hungary, and so on, that are Christian, and then the Western neoliberal globalists. These must be defeated first, and then we can have a time in history when Christianity can leaven the nations. China can be evangelized, India can be evangelized, and so on. But we're going to do that with civilization states in place that are at peace with each other without these constant wars to keep the world safe for democracy. Western-style liberal democracy is not of God. It's just as totalitarian as autocratic socialism or communism. Even more so in some cases because it results in more death. Both of them result in, millions killed, but both are pretty evil. Okay. So I think that in the next 100 years, we're going to see a new world order emerge, but not a new world order that's globalist and statist, but we'll have these multipolar Christian civilizations. Okay. This is a little chart that shows you what this might look like. These are the areas that, these are very old civilizations. This is the Eurozone. This is the United Kingdom. This is Russia, China, India, South Africa, Brazil, and then I would include all of North America. And then there's even a possibility of like Latin America joining us. And Brazil might end up being like a separate, for at least for a time, like a separate civilization. And then also you would start to see like the breadbasket of Africa, like this region in here, kind of these nations band together, because these are predominantly Christian. This could become a Christian civilization and then evangelize the northern part of Africa and get the corruption out of South Africa as well. Okay, so this is the New World Order right here. It's separate. It's multipolar. There are about 5 different poles. Okay, or 5. You get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 5 major ones and several minor ones. Okay, and that's what I really believe that we're headed toward. I think that's you're going to see that in the next 10 years or so, where it will no longer just be the United States, Europe, Japan, North Korea, and Australia killing millions of people to preserve democracy, but we'll see nations that form alliances with each other, like Russia and China and India, and they'll trade with each other and they'll prosper, and eventually Christianity will influence. Maybe there will be Christian missionaries from Russia that will influence China and India, and so on, and the United States. Maybe they'll send missionaries to us, and maybe we'll see Brazilian missionaries come to America. Actually, I won't tell that story, but there was a church that we helped plant in Venezuela back in the 80s, and they're now planting churches in Florida, which is cool. All right, so there is great hope. The religion of egalitarian humanism is collapsing under the weight of its own sin, just as communism collapsed in the 1990s, and something must arise from under the rubble, as Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn said. But it will be, right now, it's a form of nationalism or populism. That's already there. That's what we see in a lot of these countries I pointed out. But there's this continuing struggle. Our job as Christians is to provide the building blocks where there might be a true Christian civilization that arises in these nations. A model of Christian charity to heal the wounded and not just a selfish nationalism, which is this here. Okay, this is all done in the name of keeping America safe for democracy. It's done just the opposite. But I do believe there's great hope, and I hope you enjoyed my little podcast here.